My first question for Saul is, when you were all together in this group, did you have any idea of what you were going to be creating?
Well, I think it would be more accurate to say that no one on the campus at Caltech had the remotest belief that anything that was going on at JPL had any scientific or research significance. So we tended much more to be focused on solving the problems we were faced with. And that was when I decided to go to JPL rather than, say, Lincoln Labs, which I was more familiar with. Lincoln Labs had a lot of people that I viewed as very talented amateurs. But Lincoln Labs didn't really have a sense of mission. And JPL did. They had a role to play. And it always seemed to me that problems that arise in the real world, if you have the freedom to work on them by whatever tools you think are most appropriate, are really more productive than having to just dream up problems entirely on your own.
It's just remarkable to me how many of these people and the problems that you attacked and solved are still incredibly relevant to technical problems of today. And you were present at the, I guess I'd say, the dawn of the information age. And now those applications have led to many other things, and with applications in biology, in molecular biology, as you mentioned. Do you I guess I could say, where do you see this going? Are there new challenges in information and communication theory that would be relevant to current topics of interest?
Well, as early as the mid-50s, there were people saying, quote, information theory is dead. And you can find that in the published literature. And the thing is, people are ingenious enough to keep finding new, again, often motivated by problems, to find new things to study that leads to new research. In the 50s, no one was interested in multi-user communication, for example. That came later. No one was interested in coding for magnetic media. That came later. So there will always be incentives for new research. But I think it's also important to realize that scientific fields, when they first open up, typically have a half-life of about 30 years when people are making fundamental contributions. And then after that, it becomes more of a steady state field where there will be incremental contributions, but the fundamental questions have already been asked.
I'd like to get back to something that you mentioned, is that you came to USC in the early 60s, and you said at the time that you were considering Caltech and UCLA, and you ended up at USC, which seems just an incredible decision at the time. It's certainly been a tremendous benefit to USC and all the generations of students and faculty that you have mentored, that you have worked with in your career. Can you talk briefly about what are the major milestones and accomplishments that occurred since the 60s, the period that you were talking about early in your career?
Well, one way I can divide my period at USC into portions is simply by what building was I in. My first semester, I was in the building that is now called Beegler Hall, but at that time it was called the Engineering Building.
The single engineering
The Engineering Building. And by the fall of '63, Olin Hall had just opened up, and that was the first new engineering building, and I was there for 10 years. And at the end of those 10 years, Powell Hall had opened up, and I was there for 18 years. And after that, EEB had opened up, and I've been here, I think I'm in my 24th year at EEB. So I never expected that I would be in EEB longer than the 18 years that I had been in Powell Hall.
So you've occupied several different buildings,
Yeah.
most of which were constructed since you arrived.
Yeah.
And can you say something about the quality of the doctoral students, of our graduate students, and just our communications research program in general?
Well, one significant change that occurred sort of at the end of the Cold War. During the 80s and 90s, starting in the 70s, we had our distance education network actually started in the early 70s. And we were getting many of our best students as distance students working at Hughes and TRW and other major defense organizations. After 1990, the defense program lost its appeal and a lot of its funding. And this was at the same time that, especially under Steve Sample's influence, the quality of undergraduates at USC started improving very noticeably. So what I find now is when I teach courses that are also broadcast on our distance education network, the on-campus students are typically almost, well, at least half a sigma better on exams than the remote students on average. The opposite of what it would have been in the 70s and 80s. So that's one change that I've noticed. If I was being very realistic, I would say that the position that our communications group had, let's say in 1990, I would say at that time we would have been ranked #1 by anyone who knew who was who and where they were. It's a lot less clear to me that that's true today.
Well,
So while the whole School of Engineering has come up, and I would say probably even the EE department has come up, our communications group is still very strong, but it's not dominant the way it was.
So other institutions have
Other
also
institutions have
come up
started-
in quality
have started
to
improving their
rival
quality.
what we have here at USC.
Right.
And do you, so you described your experiences with Zorab Kaprilyan and his energy in assembling this remarkable group of people in the 60s. Do you suppose that USC could do something like that in the future? And if so, what are the topics?
I think
what are
that
the fields that we
I
could
think that
endeavor?
I think that
work on?
USC, as part of deciding that it is now a major research university, has erected all kinds of barriers to prevent anyone from being able to do what Zorab did. Zorab would simply decide to hire people and then announce that they were now part of the faculty. You can't do that today. I don't think Lloyd Welch's resume would have gotten him hired when he was hired. And I think a lot of people were surprised at how easy it was for me to get him into the National Academy of Engineering, where he had strong recommendations from people like Bill Perry, who were aware of what his classified work had been.
So that nowadays things are a little more structured and more
Well, they're a lot more
bureaucratic,
structured and a lot more bureaucratic. And I think we have trouble hiring people we want to hire because we can't get offers out as quickly as some other institutions can.
That's an interesting observation. I want to move on to talk about some of your other areas of study besides math and engineering and communications, because I know that you are a scholar in at least linguistics, history, biblical studies. And so, among all our faculty, I personally consider you one of our universal scholars. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little about your experiences studying these fields, as well as interactions with USC faculty who are specialized in these topics.
Well, when I was an undergraduate, even though I had entered with the idea of continuing in mathematics, the only other subject that tempted me to consider majoring in was history. I found the study of history to be fascinating. I have an interesting anecdote also about my undergraduate period. I mentioned that I met the full unit requirements to graduate in less than 2 years, but it turned out that when I was about 2 months short of the graduation date, I needed about 5 credits. And my father advised me, why don't you talk to Professor William Albright, who, to my knowledge, was the first and maybe the only person elected to the National Academy of Sciences for his research in what's called biblical archaeology. And Albright, who was a devout Protestant, was also a scholar of the Hebrew language. And my father suggested, Albright could examine me on Hebrew. And he did, and readily awarded me the 5 units that I needed to complete the graduation requirement. And I've been running a freshman seminar at USC most fall semesters for the last 15 years. And one year, purely sort of as a lark, I decided to offer a freshman seminar on the book of Genesis and the Bible. And I think I learned as much as the students did, because though I probably knew most of the book of Genesis by heart in the original Hebrew, I hadn't thought that much about it. And you always learn a lot. You learn more about a subject by teaching it than you do in any other method.
So these to me are examples of your interdisciplinary work. Have you actually worked with other faculty outside engineering at USC on particular research problems?
Well, Bruce Zuckerman in our School of Religion accuses me of knowing as much about his subject as he does.
I see. I see. Can you get him as a guest lecturer for your freshman seminar?
I should have, but
Yeah.
I didn't.
Are you offering that again? I might take it myself.
Yeah, I don't think so.
That's interesting.
But I'm glad I did it once.
If you were, after your career at USC, which is now, well, if I count full time, since 1963.
Yeah. All of 63. So it'll be.
Is there anything?
It's almost completing 52 years.
Almost 52 years.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you would change, or would you done anything differently?
Yeah, I tend not to second guess anything that I've done. I think it's always more fruitful to think about the future rather than the past.
And just in general, where do you see the future going? Could you give us any observations about that, or predictions?
Well, I think USC has made unbelievable progress in the years that I've been here, far more than I ever would have anticipated. And I think with the consecutive presidencies of Steve Sample and Max Nikias, that's sort of the formula for when you have 2 successive presidencies by first-rate people, that raises an institution to a higher level.
I think the challenge in general is just sustaining that sort of effort and continuing on the right track.
And it doesn't hurt that both of them are electrical engineers.
Exactly right. So we have the reputation for producing leaders of all sorts, both at the school level.
Yeah, we've produced
provost
university
and the
presidents for many institutions. When it was announced that our current provost, Elizabeth Garrett, will be the next president of Cornell, I sent her a congratulatory email, and I pointed out that she's following the course of Odysseus or Ulysses in going from Troy to Ithaca.
Excellent. Good.
I'm sure she'll use that in her inaugural speech at Cornell.
I see. Yeah. Can you tell us about any other memorable events in your career? You described many of them, and many stories that I had never heard before. But are there other particularly memorable things that happened, just to you personally, or in your research?
Well, I think the recognition that I've gotten that has pleasantly surprised me was first being elected to the National Academy of Engineering at a time when not that many people even knew it existed. In fact, Dave Slepian of Bell Labs was elected as part of the same class that I was. And when we met in Washington, he said that this seemed like a recognition that no one paid any attention to. It's obviously these things, if they last, they improve with age. And the reason the Nobel Prizes are so widely respected is that they've been around for more than 100 years. The National Academy of Sciences is 100 years older than the National Academy of Engineering, and that alone gives it a lot more status.
Yes, yeah, I see.
And receiving the National Medal of Science was another very pleasant surprise. I wasn't even aware that the areas I worked in were considered eligible for the Medal of Science.
Your citation for that award, I guess, cites work in mathematics and applications.
Yeah, it more cites my applications to communications. Though in President Obama's speech before awarding the original, the individual medals, he mentioned generically what different people had contributed to, and his reference to me was basically the inspiration for Tetris.
So as you said, you're widely known for polyominoes
Yes.
and related topics.
And my books on polyominoes have sold far more copies than my more technical books.
I see. On the other hand, anybody who picks up a CDMA cell phone
Yeah.
is using technology that
Yeah.
you developed, or the theory that you developed, and the public at large doesn't know that.
And I think one thing that, I've never liked the label applied mathematician for several reasons. One is the image it conjures up is a very different kind of mathematics than the kind that I do. It conjures up partial differential equations and other areas of mathematics that I've never had much of an interest in. But the other reason is when I'm working in an applications area, I try to look at the area from the point of view of the people in that area. When I'm looking at an engineering problem, I look at it as an engineer solving an engineering problem that happens to require mathematics, rather than looking for an application for mathematics that I already know.
I see. Are there any other memorable events, any other memorable things in your career that you could tell us about?
Well, I've been appointed to innumerable committees at USC, and this includes search committees. And I was on the committee that recommended Max Nikias for Dean of Engineering. I was also on the committee that recommended him for president of the university.
I see. So this way, you're widely known by faculty from
Well-
every part of the campus.
Well, I spent a year as president of the faculty senate, and that gave me much more exposure to the entire university than I would have had otherwise. And then later I spent 3.5 years as vice provost for research for the whole university, which also made me familiar with all sorts of areas like vivaria, the
Right.
raising of animals for research, that I certainly would have known nothing about had I not had that
Yes,
position.
it seems to me that the job description for these things, say being president of the faculty senate, is one that requires extreme diplomacy.
Well,
Like being secretary general at the UN or something.
Well, I considered my greatest achievement the year that I was president of the faculty senate was I was never quoted once in the Daily Trojan.
Okay. And did you learn this skill from your career as a manager at JPL? I had no idea that you were in charge of 25 people,
Yeah.
and that you had a lab with physical equipment
Yeah.
and so forth.
Well, I discovered that I was reasonably good at dealing with people at JPL. And one of the reasons I decided to leave when I did was it was clear to me that the only way that JPL knew how to reward people was by moving them up in the executive structure. And my personal preference was to be active in my own research rather than more and more just supervising the research of others.
So the top research people were awarded with a job as a manager.
Yeah, in fact, JPL, sort of in trying to keep me, offered to promote me to section head, and I resisted that.
I see. So it was at this point that you decided that you would look at the academic world?
Yeah.
I think it's still truly remarkable that you ended up at USC. It's obviously a terrific decision for all of us, a tremendous benefit to USC in,
Well, I've
in
never,
many ways.
yeah, I've never regretted it. And when I started at USC, I realized that I had these other offers, and that if USC didn't work out, I hadn't burned any bridges.
I see. Any other comments you might have about your life or your career?
Well, you know, people ask me why I haven't retired, and basically I enjoy what I do here more than anything that I can think of that I would enjoy more by retiring.
Yeah. Well, we're glad that you're here. We're delighted to have you as our Pioneer Series guest. And I guess we have a few more minutes, right? Maybe we could take a few questions from the audience. Does anybody have any particular thoughts, questions?
I
Well,
think
let's
we
start
ought
with
to pick
Bob
Saul's
Schultz.
brain, because the half-life of communications
Yeah, so I was gonna
is quite a bit further than half gone or something. Saul, do you have any advice to the faculty as to what we ought to be teaching in communications now? Do you have any advice to the PhD students about where to go to find a really unmined topic that they can develop into a thesis? What do you tell students when they come to you?
I would suggest that they talk to someone younger than I am. who might have fresher ideas.
No, but specifically, Saul, you mentioned that there is a half-life of fields at 30 years.
Well,
But then you also said information theory has somehow managed to find completely new pastures to sort of,
Yeah, what I was really talking about was the half-life of a field being exciting and considered new rather than considered established and ongoing.
Okay.
Jerry, you had a question.
Yes, so back in the 1960s, recalling my own experience in industry, we were permitted to work on problems very similar to what people are working on in the university. And so the government was funding this type of activity. And so you might say it was a training ground for people who could move into academia. That seems to have changed a lot in this country.
Yeah, it's
What are your
interesting
thoughts on
what
that?
has changed. There was something called the Mansfield Amendment that said that the DoD was only supposed to spend money on things directly related to the
To defense.
military mission.
Yeah.
And another thing that has changed very noticeably, 20 years ago, there were still research institutes funded by corporations, like the most famous being Bell Labs, but even IBM Research and Xerox PARC, a whole lot of these organizations did really interesting research. And this is not only true in electronics, it's true in the chemistry field, and partly because of where the government decided to put its research dollars. The universities have been the big beneficiaries of that, but these corporate research groups have, if not disappeared, their role has been reduced very dramatically. I don't know anyone who is still at Bell Labs that has much of a reputation.
I see.
And even the RAND Corporation and JPL and Aerospace Corp, it's much harder to find really basic research coming out of those groups.
In other words, it seems like the time horizon of the scale, the time scale of what they work on is much shorter. And the
Yeah.
broad basic problems are really not being worked on.
In fact, it occurred to me at the time of Sputnik that the U.S., relative to the space program, was not behind in scientific research. We were behind in a particular technology, and the only reason the Russians were ahead in that type of large rockets was they hadn't learned to miniaturize nuclear weapons as successfully as the United States had.
Yeah.
So they needed bigger booster rockets for intercontinental missiles.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? Comments, observations?
Have you started planning on your speech for 50 years from now? Because I'd be interested in a preview.
I actually started working on my talk today about a week ago, and that's as far in advance as I almost ever plan a speech.
That's reassuring to you.
So, I mean, I want to follow up. You said the story many times that somebody presented to you a problem that was in a different domain, but you realized that you had already a solution in another domain. Which sort of can have many applications, I mean, many implications, but the one that naturally comes to me is that you probably have hundreds of these other things for which you haven't found problems. I mean, it's not coincidence that you basically already had solutions to many of the problems that were presented to you, which means you probably have a drawers full of other results.
I think it's fair to say that Saul has a library of solutions.
Library of
And
solutions.
If you have a particular problem, you might visit him, take him out to lunch, and discuss this.
So this is something that I'd like to encourage our students and others to try with you, because I mean we want to get you to open those drawers and sort of pick some of those things.
The downside of that is you may become exceedingly popular all of a sudden.
So I think that almost all of my major contributions to engineering have been in response to someone asking me about a problem
Yes.
area.
So I think this is for the students and the faculty. Ask.
And you shall receive.
And you shall receive.
Yeah, it's Petros.
Yeah, mathematics is a very clean field in the sense that it's either true or false. So when you get into fields like history, with a different point of views, how do you find it? How do you feel?
Can you restate
So
the
he's-
question?
I think what I think Petros was saying is that fields such as history are very, very different from mathematics and engineering. How do you? How are you able to change your mindset to look at issues in history, and why does that appeal to you in its being so different from math?
Well, I think studies have shown that people in the natural sciences tend to be in favor of classical fields in the humanities, including history and literature, and much less favorably disposed to the social sciences like psychology and I fit that pattern.
I see. Did I get the question right?
I think so, but I didn't understand the answers.
But also what I enjoyed as an undergraduate depended a great deal on the skill of the faculty members that were teaching those subjects.
Oh, I see, okay.
And I thought I had extremely good history professors when I was an undergraduate. Hopkins had a mandatory 2-year world history requirement, and I had one professor the first year for history from antiquity up to Napoleon. And for the second year, half of it was American history, and the professor who taught that became the professor of American history at Yale. And the other half was really modern European history. The biggest gap in the education of 99% of college graduates in America, what happened in Europe in the 19th century. The professor I had for that became the professor at Harvard for that type of history.
This reminds me of another question that I had too. Is that so? As you said, you graduated from Johns Hopkins as an undergraduate after 2 years. How did you ever manage to do that? Did you take 8 classes a semester? Did you take classes at night in the summer? How did you do that?
Okay, I had a little bit of college credit from one of the programs I was in high school. I did take 2 summer courses, the one summer between my 2 years. I also placed out of a math course for which they gave me credit when I started. But other than that, yeah, I took a lot more courses, and since I was never in trouble in any of my classes, nobody paid that much attention to what courses I was signing up for.
Did you have an advisor who said, you better watch out, if you're taking 8 classes, you might get in trouble?
The advisor I had my first year had no interest at all in advising, and for me that was ideal.
That's fine. Or you take your registration card and the advisor just signs it.
And in graduate school, I knew more about number theory than any member of the faculty at Harvard at that time. In fact, the chair asked me if I would respond to a request at Boston University for someone to teach a course in number theory for them, which I did.
So you did, really?
And my advisor of record, David Witter, prided himself on getting all of his students through the PhD program. And In fact, one of the issues was that I have to take language exams, and my advisor David Witter was in charge of that requirement, and I visited him at his office in Widener Library, the big research library at Harvard, and he had several journals on his desk, and I told him, pick one, and fortunately for me, he picked a journal from Israel called Rivion La Matematica, Mathematical Quarterly, and the cover was in English and the opposite cover was in Hebrew. So I looked at the Hebrew cover and he looked at the English cover, and I translated for him the titles of the articles.
So he decided that you knew
He
enough Hebrew
decided
to
I
get
knew-
by.
if I knew
Okay.
an obscure language like that. But I enjoyed French and German, which I took as an undergraduate at Hopkins. And in both cases, it was because of really good graduate student teachers. My first year of French, I had a wonderful graduate student instructor. The next year for second year, I had a full professor in the French department who wasn't nearly as good. He was okay, but he wasn't outstanding like the graduate student I had the first year. I had credit for 1 year of German from high school. For second year German, I had a really good graduate student. His first language was German. And I later looked him up on Google. He ended up as a professor of German at some university. But they were outstanding teachers, and that's what
So good teaching, both by
Yeah.
the faculty and by teaching assistants,
Yeah.
graduate assistants.
Yeah,
is
and
important.
Hopkins had the model that most undergraduate courses are taught by graduate TAs. In fact, the only time I had a professor rather than a graduate student in my major, mathematics, was the one summer course I took in mathematics. That was the only time where I discovered that the instructor probably knew more about the subject than I did.
Sal, I'd
Cindy?
like to go back, how you mentioned that you were affected by the G.H. Hardy's way of thinking about pure mathematics. Mathematics had to be pure. Looking back at how you have opened up your filing cabinet and found solutions to practical problems, how do you feel about that now in retrospect?
Well, I gave a talk at a mathematics meeting when I agreed to give the talk, I observed that the date, 6 months in the future, would be on the 40th anniversary of the Russian launch of Sputnik 1. So I titled the talk, before I knew what I would say, Mathematics 40 Years After Sputnik. But what I actually talked about was how pretty much everywhere the attitude about applied mathematics or applications of mathematics had changed dramatically since the time that I was a graduate student. And I quoted extensively from Hardy's book and showed how nonsensical many of his specific statements were. Like, he admitted that relativity and quantum mechanics had some interesting mathematics, but neither of those would ever lead to any useful applications. That was one of his assertions.
Do you have a copy of that talk?
Hmm?
Do you have the transcripts of that talk?
Do I have a?
The script for that talk that you gave?
Yeah, and I will make the typographical corrections and
That
distribute
would be
it.
interesting.
That would be interesting.
You know, I have a problem that there's an event that starts at 5 p.m. where they won't admit anyone late. It's on campus.
Yeah, this is
With
Bill
So-
Clinton.
a former president. So Jerry, you had a final question, then we can.
Well, yeah, Sal, I had heard that you wrote a paper with Paul Erdos. And Erdos.
My honest
with
Erdős
people,
number
whatever.
is
Can
2,
you just summarize your
that I've
experience?
co-authored papers with 7 or 8 people that co-authored papers with Erdős. But I tell people that I consider that Erdős number is defined. Your Erdős number is 1 if you've co-authored a paper with Erdős. It's 2 if you've co-authored a paper with someone who's co-authored a paper with Erdős. But I tell people I think my Erdős number is really -1 because hundreds of people have written papers titled On a Problem of Erdős. But Erdős wrote a paper on a problem of Golomb.
Okay.
On that note, we should.
On that note,
Okay, well.
But by the way, when I was my first year here, I was hired as an associate professor, and for the second year, in order to promote me both to full professor, not only in double E but in mathematics, Zorab told me that the math department would require a letter of recommendation. So I got my letter of recommendation from Erdős, and that was quite sufficient.
All I can say is that things have changed a lot since then. So I think our time is ending, and once again we want to thank Saul for his talk and for your very entertaining interview, and just in general, just thanks for being part of USC. You're just been an outstanding asset to our university.
I'd like to thank all of you very much.